as we speak, cruise missiles with high explosives are raining down on civilian targets and infrastructure targets in
Well, we have the
Ukraine.
word of the Ukrainians that they're raining down on civilian targets. We don't have any objective assessment of such a thing at all.
Are you denying that?
What we do have is the knowledge that since
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 147 for the 8th of September 2022. I know people like the editorial bit. It is going to be in this podcast, sort of, but it's after the interview. That'll make sense when you hear it. But first I want to say thanks to all of our patrons on Patreon, especially Sean Doyle, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. And he also said some very nice things about the podcast. That's great to hear. It makes it all worthwhile. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. It pays for things like web hosting and phone bills. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And as I said, Sean said all the nice things that he likes about the podcast. It's a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon, or when we get any feedback at all from listeners, really. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as Sean and the other donors and throw in the price of a Christmas selection box once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have Eoin Ó Murchú. He lists himself on his Twitter bio as a communist Republican. He was the political editor for Raidió Gaeltachta for a long time, and now he writes for Tuairisc.ie. Eoin, you've been commenting a lot on the war between Russia and Ukraine since that started with that invasion in February. Do you want to give us just your take on that? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, the rights and wrongs of it. Russia was essentially presented with very little options. NATO has been expanding eastwards and eastwards, despite promises made when the Soviet Union ceased to exist that it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. It has continued to expand eastward, and it's there to be seen that Russia is almost encircled by member states of NATO, which as far as Russia is concerned are, of course, hostile states. The last two remaining pieces of that jigsaw are Ukraine and Georgia. What Russia looked for was a commitment, both by Ukraine and by NATO, that Ukraine would not be brought into NATO. That was refused point blank. The second thing, since the coup in 2014, areas of the Ukrainian state which rejected the coup, mainly Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian areas in the east, the Donbass and the south and so on, had themselves attacked by the Ukrainian armed forces. Since 2014, nearly 10,000 people have been killed in shelling by the Ukrainian army on the Donbass. What Russia looked for was therefore two key things: a commitment that Ukraine wouldn't be in NATO, and an end to the attacks on the Donbass. They proposed the Minsk Accords, which would have allowed the Donbass to remain within the Ukrainian state, but with an autonomy to protect it against anti-Russian language legislation and so on. And these accords, though signed by Ukraine, were never implemented, probably under pressure from the United States. Against that background as well, we have the clear growth of Nazi glorification in Ukraine, the declaration of Stepan Bandera as a hero. Bandera was the man who organized the extermination of the Jews in Ukraine during the Nazi period. And of course, the most infamous of those massacres, the one at Babi Yar, was carried out by the Ukrainian SS division, which now has a commemorative march every year in Lvov in the west of Ukraine. So all of these factors together, Russia looked for negotiations to avoid these issues. It looked for an all-European conference to discuss security for all states, including Ukraine, the Baltics, everybody. That was refused. And Russia was faced with a choice where it could sit back, allow NATO to establish its bases right on the border with Russia, merely 5 minutes flying time for a missile from there to Moscow. This was clearly an intolerable thing. The United States wouldn't have accepted it in Cuba or Venezuela, but the Russians were supposed to accept it there. And faced with those realities, they launched an invasion to, if you like, enforce the demands that they were looking for.
Okay, pause with that. And I just want to kind of go back a little bit there. So first of all, you said that Russia is encircled by NATO. Russia is an enormous country. It is the largest country in the world by quite a margin. It has borders with NATO countries in the form of Norway in the extreme north, a border that you could almost throw a stone across, and certainly not any level of security threat to Russia. And Estonia and Latvia also border Russia proper, who they're obviously NATO members, and Lithuania and Poland, they border a small exclave of Russia called Kaliningrad, which is a small area about the size of Northern Ireland on the Baltic Sea. That's not encirclement by a mile, and that's just a geographic fact, I would thought. But I don't want to get too bogged down in that, because you seem to be saying there that the demands, wants, desires of what you say Russia, what I think it might be useful to make a distinction between the authorities in the Kremlin and the interests of the wider Russian nation, but leave that aside. You seem to be saying that they're entitled to invade another sovereign country in a most brutal and cruel way because they didn't get their way. Now, you were in the, as I understand it, you were in the Workers' Party in the 1980s, and if you can imagine an alternative reality, maybe where a party like the Workers' Party came to power in Ireland, maybe Ireland decided to join the Warsaw Pact in the 1980s, ally itself with what was then the Soviet Union, would Britain have been entitled to invade Ireland to prevent Ireland from doing that?
Well, first of all, I was never a member of the Workers' Party. I was a member of the official Republican movement, part of which evolved into the Workers' Party after I left them.
Nevertheless, they were relatively friendly with the Soviet Union, and in an alternative reality where Ireland had democratically maybe voted for a Marxist government and decided to join the Warsaw Pact, would that have been sufficient, just that decision, even if they didn't do it, would that have been sufficient justification for Britain to invade Ireland?
No, the issue is, as I think you're trying to avoid, is that Russia looked for negotiations on all of these issues of contention. This was based on the European Conference on Security in Europe, the OCSE, which in 1998, with Bertie Ahern, by the way, signing the declaration on behalf of Ireland, which said that each member state in Europe had a right to look to its own security. But, and this is the important point,
which includes
but it
Ukraine.
had to do so within the context that it would not threaten its neighbors. The establishment of US missile bases, 5 minutes flying time from Moscow, is, I think, a clear threat to Russia.
Well, hold on for a second. One at a time. No, Owen, I'm going to stop you there. One at a time.
You
said 5 minutes
has been
flying.
Traditional invasion route into Russia. So the question is that you have to take into account the security rights of your neighbors. We would have a right to defend our country. We would be extremely foolish, incredibly reckless, if we were to, if we like, throw down a gauntlet of the kind you describe. What Ukraine was asked to do before the invasion happened was to sit down and negotiate a way of getting around all of these problems without a recourse to force. And that was essentially refused by NATO and then by the puppet government which NATO has established in Kiev.
Okay, there's no evidence that Ukraine has a puppet government, but what I want to
there is lots of evidence that Ukraine has a puppet government. The most telling part of it is the statement of Barbara Newland, who was the US controller of Ukraine at the time of the coup, when she decided who would be the prime minister, who would be in the government, who would run the security services, and so on. So just because we don't read these things in the Irish Times or hear about them on RTE doesn't mean that they haven't happened. The record is quite clear. The statements made by Barbara Newland as to how she envisaged Ukraine being ruled in the future.
Okay, and that's not something that we can resolve, or the veracity of what she was saying. But do Ukraine not have an equal right to security as Russia does?
Yes, of course it does. Of course it does.
And you
but it doesn't have a right to security by allowing itself to become a puppet of NATO and threatening its neighbours. Leaving aside the morality of it, the issue is the sense of it. It's absolutely reckless for Ukraine to make itself an armed wing of NATO with all the destruction that has brought upon the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people.
No, that hasn't.
When all of this could have been avoided by genuine negotiations and an accommodation of the security interests of all of the states involved, which is exactly what Russia looked for.
Okay. Eoin, the way we run this podcast is we try to analyze things, and one way to do that is to not have a gish gallop. It's to take one step at a time and to look at one issue at a time. And the internet is big. We can fit as much audio time on that. We're not under a ticking clock. And I want to look at each of those individually. I don't want to jump from one to the other, because that's not a good way to analyze the issue. So first of all, you said, for example, Ukraine was a traditional invasion route to Russia. I'm not sure if Genghis Khan used that route, but the point is that the security threat, as has been proven, to Ukraine is vastly greater than any security threat that ever existed to Russia. And under the Helsinki Accords, which is that each country is entitled to its own integrity, there is no right of one country, just because it doesn't like what's going on in another country, to invade. And
you have deliberately ignored the decision of the European Conference.
Owen, remember what I said. Owen, remember what I said. I said we will deal with each of those issues separately, and I will come on to it.
You can't just take a point and reject the context of it. The 1998 conference, which Ireland was a signatory to, agreed that no country could, if you like, assert its own security interests at the expense of its neighbours.
And is Russia bound by that? Is Russia bound by that? Is Russia bound by that?
NATO would take over in Ukraine. Russia looked for negotiations and for a Europe-wide conference to guarantee the security of all states.
And is Russia bound by that?
It wasn't Russia that refused to negotiate. It was NATO that refused to negotiate.
Okay, but can you see that there is no comparison between an alleged theoretical threat to Russia and the fact that, as we speak, cruise missiles with high explosives are raining down on civilian targets and infrastructure targets in
we have the word of the Ukrainians that they're raining down on civilian targets. We don't have any objective assessment of such a thing at all.
Are you denying that?
What we do have is the knowledge that since 2014, the Ukrainian armed forces shelled civilian areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, and other areas of the Donbass.
How do we have that?
We know that. We know that 10,000 people, mainly civilians, were killed in those shellings.
How do we have that information?
That is something which you conveniently want to put aside as, we can discuss that somewhere down the line. It's not down the line for the people who live there.
How do we have that information?
We have that information because the United Nations itself has recognized that there has been shelling since 2014.
Not by Ukraine.
And if you did your research
no, they
properly,
have not. They have
you
not.
would
The
know
United Nations have
that
not
this has been
recognized
a
what you said.
major complaint from the people of the Donbass right the way through since 2014, when the democratically elected government was overthrown by a coup. A coup financed and organized by the United States.
Oh, pause by that. The Russian ambassador to Ireland, Filatov, I believe is his name, has explicitly said that Ireland assisting Ukraine to remove mines that Russia has planted in Ukraine constitutes Ireland getting involved in the war. You can agree or not on that. I don't want to discuss that issue.
Do you want me to explain that to you?
No, I don't. I want
you want me to
no, I do not. I want
you
you to listen to the end of the question.
You're not asking a question. You're making a statement.
Yeah, so pause until I get to the question. That pretty clearly indicates that Russia is planting minefields in Ukraine.
No, let me tell you exactly what the situation is. When people say we are training people in demining, I don't know if you know the military aspects that are involved, but that means you have to teach people how to lay mines in order that they will understand how to demine them. So what is being proposed is that Ireland is not just a peaceful operation of getting mines out of the way. You have to train people in how to place them, which, by the way, Ukraine has certainly been doing on a widespread scale, not least in the Black Sea itself.
That was not what Mr.
The argument that in some way Ireland, which is a neutral country theoretically, and should of course be campaigning to use its neutrality to encourage peace and negotiations, instead is taking part in the war effort of one side. That is a shameful abandonment of an important principle which Ireland has held since the foundation of the independent state.
Okay. What does Ukraine have to negotiate?
It has to negotiate, A, that it will not be a member of NATO, and B, that the attacks on the ethnic Russian populations of Donbass in the south will stop. But matters have of course, gone far beyond the Minsk Accords, when it was possible to envisage that these secessionist areas would remain within the Ukrainian state.
What's
that
the
has now
of the
gone
secessionist
past.
Areas?
There needs to be an acceptance by Ukraine. It will not be in NATO. It will not be a base for hostile action against its neighbors, and that it will not threaten or use violence against the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian populations of Donbass and the south.
Okay. In the last few days, I have personally been speaking to someone from the Donbass, actually from Donetsk. Their description of life under the rule of Russian proxies literally makes your skin crawl.
I have no doubt you can find Quisling in any situation who will provide the propaganda that you want.
I didn't
but
do
the reality is that
the
secessionist areas have been complaining since 2014
no, they have not.
That Russia was very reluctant to give them the support that they needed and that they were fighting for their survival. The casualty lists which have been suffered by the people of the Donbass due to Ukrainian shelling is there for all to see, but not apparently for you to find in research. It's there for everyone else to come to terms with.
What's the source
I suggest that you should go and look it up and find out exactly what has happened in the Donbass.
Sure, tell me, what's its source?
The source is the United Nations for a start.
No, it's not. The United Nations have not said anything. No, I've looked at that very carefully. The United Nations have not said anything that is...
Obviously, US sources matter more to you. You can look at Jeffrey Sachs, the United States economist. You can look at Scott Ritter, who was the former UN's arms inspector in Iraq. You can look at Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was a security advisor to the US White House. So you can look at all of these people and find the information if you want to find the information. But that is the critical problem of our society, that we have censored out the pro-Russian analysis of the situation to the extent that people just have never heard it.
Owen, I have researched that very carefully, and the
not
line,
that carefully.
excuse me,
Owen,
managed
to know that the Donbass has been shelled since 2014 and that over 10,000 people have died in that shelling.
Owen, the people from Donetsk who I spoke to were primarily concerned by the rule of thugs, of local criminals and imported
people. The people that I spoke to, both from Donetsk and
Russia,
in particular from Mariupol, were people who were massively relieved that the Russians had liberated them from the terror inflicted on them by the fascist Azov battalion, which was driven out of Mariupol, as you know. And I can, if you like, I can send you a link of a video done by Patrick Lancaster, another US journalist, not a Russian journalist, a US journalist, who interviewed people in Mariupol, explaining why it was such a relief that the fascists had been driven out. But again, that's not something apparently that you're interested in.
Patrick Lancaster, having worked for RT, the Kremlin-funded TV channel. But I just want to go back to... Hold on for a second.
What difference does that make? Are you saying... I mean, I know people who've worked for the Irish Times. That doesn't mean to say that they are fountains of truth all the time, or that they're fountains of lies. The issue is the professionalism of the work being done. And what you are suggesting is that any attempt to present issues from a Russian point of view is ipso facto wrong, unfounded, and made up. Whereas, in fact, the reverse is the case.
Owen, what I'm saying is that sources that are coming directly from the Kremlin are not credible. And this is why I want you to listen to this clip. I want you to listen to this clip. Just 1 second, Owen. I want you to listen to this clip from the Russian ambassador.
Our sources coming directly from
Owen,
NATO.
Please.
Sources coming directly from the United States. These are the sources which are not credible. And we have in our media right across the board a blanket, one-sided coverage. We don't hear the interviews of the people who live in Mariupol.
Okay, then let's hear from a Russian source. We don't hear the interviews of the people that... We don't hear about the 2.5 million refugees from Ukraine who've taken refuge in Russia. We don't hear about that. So let's hear from somebody like that. Let's hear from the Russian ambassador to Ireland. This is
no,
eight.
You don't have
this
to
is
look
eight.
For the Russian ambassador.
Just 1 second,
Contact
Owen.
The journalists on the ground,
can you knock it off for a second
and pause
for a second to let me play the clip?
You do an interview directly with people who live in Mariupol and people who live in the Donbass. And people like Patrick Kavanagh will help you find people to interview if you're unable to do it yourself.
Patrick Lancaster, I think you're referring to, but I want to listen to this clip.
It does look like a case of collective insanity, almost, which in fact is made up of the, I would say, deliberate attempt by the US and the allies to inflate tensions in Europe. We do not have any plans of invading anybody, least of all Ukraine, which is our neighboring country. We don't have any political, military, economic, or whatever other reason to do that.
So that's the Russian ambassador to Ireland 8 days before they actually did invade Ukraine. And this is the Russian ambassador to the US 4 days after that, on the 20th of February.
I'll get right to it. President Biden says that President Putin has decided to invade Ukraine. Is he correct?
There is no innovation and there is no such plans. It was fixed in Russian documents that we conveyed to our American friends in the State Department. Russia has publicly declared its readiness to continue the diplomatic efforts to resolve all outstanding issues. Russian troops are on a sovereign
There you have the
Russian,
point. It committed itself to continue the diplomatic efforts. Those diplomatic efforts were then absolutely, unequivocally rebuffed. What you are saying is that Russia should have laid back then and allowed Ukraine to be established as a NATO missile base against Russia and do nothing about it, that it should have abandoned the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian populations of the Donbass and allowed the Ukrainian armed forces, including the fascist Azov battalion, to slaughter and terrorize at will. No way could that happen. And faced with the absolute refusal of NATO and particularly the United States to engage in discussions and negotiations on these issues, and in particular their refusal to have an all Europe-wide conference on security for all Europe states, that I think answers the question very, very clearly. At the end of the day,
okay,
Russia
but how could they
no
trust
choice.
a word that the Russians say?
Well, they had no choice, and that's absolutely clear.
No, 4 days before the invasion, they said they would absolutely not invade.
It's a matter of indifference as to whether they should have joined, whether Ukraine would be a member of NATO or not. I'd like to hear you make the same argument about whether Cuba should have missile bases pointing at the United States, or whether Mexico should join a military alliance with China to threaten the United States. We just know that in the real world, the United States would not tolerate such a thing. Why do we expect Russia to lie down on the ground and let a very, very hostile and aggressive NATO machine, which has a record of invasions? And you talk about a brutal invasion, by the way. If you want to see a brutal invasion, look at what the US did in Iraq.
So
1 million people died.
Do you set your moral standards by what the US does?
Nothing on that scale in Ukraine. And look at what they did in Iraq, in Libya, Afghanistan, and all of these countries.
What about
so don't try and pretend that the United States is just an innocent party giving, generous support from the outside. It's a key player and a key instigator of everything that has happened. But the most important point is we as a country should be fighting to try and bring the war to an end. That requires negotiations. It requires accommodation of all of the elements involved. But when the president's wife suggested we do that, there was absolute outrage from all the anti-Russian racists who dominate our media and our political life.
When you're out and about, Eoin, do you see a lot of virulent Russophobia in Dublin?
Yes, I see it. I see it all the time. You only have to turn RTE on, and you can see it. You can turn on German television, and you'll hear people directly talking about Russians. Well, these aren't really Europeans; they're barbarians. This is the language, by the way, that was used by the Nazis, and this is the language which is used again. That they're not normal people; they're different from us. A bit like Alan Dukes with his attack on the border community here in Ireland. Russians are supposed to be somewhat less than human, not really European, and you know what? I think a bit Asiatic. Now, if that isn't racism, I don't know what is.
Eoin, so when Yuri Filatov, the Russian ambassador, says that Russophobic hysteria is prevalent in Ireland, you agree with him?
Oh, absolutely. You see that all the time.
And of course, that is fanned. You've said yes, that's clear. You've been clear on that. I want to move on to something else.
It is fanned by the media's censorship of pro-Russian forces, which are never heard on RTE, never seen in the Irish Times or any of the main media. The only place where you will get them is on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. And lo and behold, there's a big campaign to have these institutions closed down because they allow a different point of view to be expressed.
Okay, pause on that. I want to go to a tweet that you wrote in April, and this is Oscailga, and I will give the version that you wrote, and you can tell me if I'm getting the translation right or wrong. I think your Gaelga will be far better than mine. So you said, is far rochmesh a Putin, Marto Biden Macronasella, och ni natie is kinta ni hoganche omos do natia starula nos bandera. So as I understand, my translation of that is to say that Putin is a rich man, just like Biden and Macron and others, but he's not a Nazi and he never pays homage to historical Nazis. Is that a reasonable translation?
No, not exactly. What I said was Putin is a capitalist and a defender of capitalism, which came in with the overthrow of the Soviet Union. I'm not a defender of Putin.
I'm not asking. I just want to clarify what you meant. Pause on that. So Rochmesh you wouldn't translate as wealthy.
And in that regard, to describe Putin as a Nazi is clear, absolute balderdash.
I didn't describe Putin
there is no
as a Nazi.
glorification of Nazism in Russia. There is a glorification of Nazism in the west of Ukraine, where there are statues to Stepan Bandera, the exterminator of Ukraine's Jewish population during the war, and where they've even put Bandera on their national stamps. So you have a real glorification of Nazism in
allow me to ask the question
and
before you
empty
answer
abuse elsewhere.
Owen, I want you to pause and allow me to ask the question before you answer. Can you hold on for a second? I know you've spent many years on the radio and you're a very, very tenacious debater, but I want you to pause until I ask the question. When you say ni Nazi is Kinta ni Hoganche Omosh do Nazia Sarula, that's saying Putin is not a Nazi and it is for sure he doesn't honour historical Nazis. That's a correct translation, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is stunning, I believe, because
why is it stunning?
Allow me to do it, and please don't shout down because people don't like hearing that. Allow me to develop the idea for a minute or two. Ivan Ilyin was a general or a senior member of the White Russian Army that fought against the Russian Communist Red Army in 1917, 1918, 1919 onwards. He went into exile in Germany after the Whites, the Tsarists, obviously lost the Russian Civil War to the Communists and the Soviet Union was created. He was a Nazi icon. He was a fascist to the core. He supported the accession of Hitler to power. He fell out with the Nazis later and went, luckily for him, to live in Switzerland, which meant he survived the war. He lived until the 1950s and he wrote extensively and he was virulently opposed to democracy. He was virulently chauvinistic and he advocated a sort of authoritarian state that where people have no rights whatsoever. He advocated an even stronger state and he strongly supported the Nazis. He we know because we have heard the words from Putin's mouth. He is the primary inspiration of Vladimir Putin. And I just want you to listen to this clip. This is in Russian. Oh, well, okay.
Absolute bull.
Well, listen to the clip then. This is...
you can't listen to nonsense. You come out with this rubbish. Absolute total rubbish.
Well, let me play the clip.
Certainly Putin is anti-communist. As I say, I'm not a defender of Putin. But Putin is not someone who has glorified the Nazi collaborators who joined in the attack on the Soviet Union. That is just a blatant lie, my friend.
Okay,
a blatant lie.
Allow me to play the clip.
No,
this is a few seconds in
Russian.
Can
you play a clip when you are lying quite clearly?
Well, will you hear? Can we hear Putin's voice?
The point
hear Putin's
is very simple. What Putin stands for is what Putin says.
Okay, well then can we hear what Putin says? Can we hear what Putin says,
about
please?
What he wants in relation
can you
to
be quiet long enough to hear what
Putin
Putin
his demands
says?
Are.
I will
the
do
demands
in Russian
are
and
for
in
neutrality,
English.
For an end to violence against the ethnic Russian population, and for denazification.
I will
what
play
is
in
wrong
Russian
with a single one of those demands?
Have a listen and I will try to tell you.
Owen,
I can answer if you can be quiet long enough.
No, you can't answer because I've asked you several times, and all you keep on doing is throwing in irrelevancies.
Hold on for 1 second.
The arguments are very clear. Russia had a choice of bowing down to NATO or standing up. It stood up to NATO. And the consequences of that are very important for the world because it means the United States' effort to establish a unipolar system which it dominates have been set back massively.
Okay, this is the voice of Vladimir Putin. Just a very brief clip in Russian. So a patriot, Ivan Alexandrovich Ilyin, that's who he's referring to. That is the ending of his speech. He ends his speech when he is annexing the provinces of Ukraine, and I'll play it with the translation for you.
Well, he didn't annex the provinces of Ukraine, as you say. What he did was he organized referendums in them, in which the majority of the people who voted to join Russia, and with great relief and rejoicing, as anyone could have seen had our television service bothered to play the clips. But of course they didn't, because like yourself, they're trying to find obscure people of no relevance whatsoever to try and claim the opposite of what's about.
Oh, and you are repeating yourself, and I want to play this because I'm very determined
an end to violence against ethnic Russians,
and I am very
and an end to the glorification of people like Bandera and the SS divisions.
Okay,
and I ask you again a simple question:
what
is wrong with any one of those commands?
This is my podcast, and I ask the questions, and I'm going to play this clip, and I'd ask you to. I would ask you to listen to this.
You come out with a whole host of NATO propaganda, and we have to take that quietly without challenging it. No way, my friend.
And I would ask you to have the courtesy. I have a clip that is 19 seconds long. I would have asked you to have the courtesy
of what is behind the military intervention. And I've asked you, what is wrong with any one of them?
Okay, Owen, I would ask you to have the courtesy to listen to a 19-second clip.
No, you have the courtesy. Don't give me that bullshit. You have the courtesy to take on a debate, instead of which you're trying to present yourself as some type of objective viewpoint from the outside who is honest and open and uncommitted. That isn't what is true about your performance.
And
so I'm asking you again.
Put a question to you.
Three simple points. Why do you refuse to answer which one of those points you disagree with?
Give me the 3 points, and I will come to them after I have
a neutral Ukraine, an end to the attacks on the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian populations of Donbass and the South, and a stop to the glorification of Nazis like Bandera and the SS divisions recruited in Ukraine by the Nazis.
I will address every one of those, but I want you to have the courtesy to listen to the points that I'm raising.
No, you have the courtesy. Stop being so superior. You have the courtesy.
I have noted those 3 points, and I will address each of them.
You've made, I've taken on your argument, and I'm asking you to have the courtesy to answer them instead of trying to present yourself as some holier than thou above the fray when you are clearly not.
Okay. You have given 3 points, and I have committed. I will address each of those very shortly. I want to finish the point that I was making. And the point is, this is the translation of the clip that I gave earlier.
I'm not interested in the translation of anything. I'm interested in the declarations of Putin as to what the purpose of the war is.
Oh, well, let's go to that.
They've been made very clear. They've been repeated over and over again. And yet, for some reason, this is something which you're going to deal with in the far-off, distant future.
No, I meant in this podcast within the next few minutes. However, since you want to do that, I want to refer you to RIA Novosti. RIA Novosti is the Russian government news and information service. It's related to...
Actually, I used to work for RIA Novosti, so I know exactly what it is.
Okay. It is a Russian government funded...
news agency in exactly the same way as exists in many, many countries. It has state support to set it up, but it republishes material from all across the board, from Russian publications and internationally as well, of people who are interested in the Russian situation, issues on politics, on economics, on cultural matters. RIA Novosti is a very broad organization and is not a mere tool, a mere puppet tool of the Kremlin, as you seem to imagine it to be.
Okay, listeners can make their decision as to how independent that is likely to be. In April...
Well, I work for them. I work for them, so I know how independent it is. I know that nobody ever said to me, "Oh, Owen, the word from Moscow is you can't say this, you can't write that." Nobody ever said anything like that to me. So don't be ridiculous and be making up stuff. You're unfortunate in this case. You're actually talking to somebody who did work for RIA Novosti.
Oh, okay. I'm pretty sure I will agree with you entirely, but I want to get to the article, because the article was published in April and was absolutely clear in what Russia wanted to do in Ukraine. And they said that they wanted to kill everyone who had been in the military and all of the intellectuals and subject the rest of the population to, quote, decades. I've got it in front of me and I will link it to...
is to decimate the Ukrainian military forces. And of course they are doing that. Even von der Leyen has admitted that the Ukrainian armed forces have suffered 100,000 dead. That's 100,000 young men killed in this mad enterprise that NATO was forced upon Ukraine. The realities of the situation, again, by the way, let me make one other point in relation to Raidió. It publishes opinion articles from a wide range of people. It does not take editorial responsibility or culpability for anything that's said by anyone. It publishes materials which will help the general debate. So even if the article says the things which you say it does, and I doubt that very much, that in no way represents anything other than here is an article which has been published on these issues. Clearly, smashing the Ukrainian ability to have a military force, that's what war is about. And that's what the Russians are doing, slowly, grindingly, definitely. And of course, we'll go on to ultimate victory as a result of that. But a victory at the cost of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of ordinary Ukrainian people, 2.5 million of whom, I repeat, have taken refuge in Russia itself to escape the depredations of your fascist friends in the Azov battalion.
What is your view of the Wagner Group?
Well, the Wagner Group is like any of these mercenary forces. I've seen it described as a fascist group. It is merely part of the mercenary armed forces which the British have created, the Americans have created, ex-members of their armed forces have engaged in these things. It's a pretty unsavory mob. It's guns for hire, and I've no doubt that they're willing to be hired by the pro-Russian side. They're probably willing to be hired by the anti-Russian side.
I'd be surprised at that. But just hold on for 1 second. So my question, I didn't. Dimitri Utkin, with whom Putin poses for photographs,
for years, with much closer ties, I might add, to the British intelligence, military intelligence. But Britain was able to say, this has nothing to do with us. These are independent forces.
Yeah, but I didn't ask about them. I asked about because you seem to be very exercised by neo-Nazis. I asked about the Wagner Group, which was founded by Dimitri Utkin, who poses for photographs with Putin, clearly approvingly. And on other days,
you go back to this nonsense.
And on
somebody
other days,
posing for a photograph of Putin,
and is hired by Putin.
What rubbish is that? I have posed for photographs with Michal Martin.
And has he paid you money to
does that make me an opponent of Irish neutrality? Does that make me an opponent of the reunification of Ireland because I've posed for photographs with Michal Martin? Clearly not. If you're involved in political debate or if you're involved in journalism, you meet other people who are involved and people who are involved from different perspectives for yourself. And in a civilized way, you carry on your interactions with them in as civilized a manner as you can.
Do you accept that Dimitri Utkin is a neo-Nazi?
That is getting more difficult, but I'm always very affable in dealing with these people.
Do you accept that Dimitri Utkin is a neo-Nazi?
No, I don't know anything about the man.
Tattoos, he's got swastika tattoos.
And frankly, I couldn't care less. You're deliberately trying to shift the focus of this debate away from what it's about. What it's about is very simple. Should Ukraine be a member of NATO? Is Ukraine being a member of NATO a threat to Russia? Clearly it is. Is it an existential threat to Russia? I think very much so it is. In these circumstances, what should Russia do? Bow down to the glorious might of the land of the home of the brave and the land of the free, or stand up and say, no way, Jose? And that's exactly what the Russians have done. They've put a stop to NATO's gallop, and the rest of the world will benefit because the unipolar global system which the United States wants to impose is crumbling before our eyes. We have even seen the fact that the whole effort to keep everybody in check by using the dollar as a reserve currency is now forcing more and more countries throughout the world
down on
to
residential
abandon the
areas in
dollar
Ukraine
and
have
look
to
for
do
a
with
new
using the
reserve
dollar as
currency.
a reserve currency?
American capitalism has started a war which will actually end in the defeat of American capitalism.
Oh, and you seem desperate to talk about anything other than what's going on. What in the hell does the
the
US
country.
using the
You're
dollar
the one
as a
who wants to
reserve
talk
currency
about,
have to do
people
with
that nobody has ever heard of and that aren't
launching
relevant
missiles
players in
at
the
civilian
situation.
targets in Ukraine?
I'm talking to you about why the Russians intervened militarily in Ukraine, and I'm also talking to you about what are the bases on which there will be peace restored. The basis on which peace will be restored is quite clear. An absolute commitment Ukraine will not be in NATO. The denazification of the glorification of Bandera, the Azov Battalion and the other fascist forces, and an end to the assault on the ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking populations of Donbass and the south. I've said it so many times, one has to wonder whether you shouldn't go to Specsavers so that you could hear it properly.
Not sure if that's not mixing your metaphors, Owen. I don't think, if you're not going to address any of the questions that I'm going to ask, I don't think there's any point in continuing further.
Well, on the contrary, I resent that whole insinuation.
Well, then you need to be quiet long enough for me to ask a question.
Single argument. I've addressed every single argument you have made.
You most certainly
what
have
I
not,
haven't
because you
done
haven't allowed me to say
is I
them.
haven't
And
sat here supinely while you have trotted out Makey-up nonsensical propaganda one bit after the other. I've stated a clear position as to why the Russians had no choice to do what they did. I've also pointed out that the longer the war goes on, the real people who suffer calamitously from it are the people of Ukraine, whose country is being destroyed, 100,000 of their young men dead in the armed forces, another 100,000 at least disabled, wounded, out of combat. Think of all the widows, the children without fathers.
And Putin can stop it tomorrow by putting his tanks into reverse gear,
which could have been avoided had NATO and the Ukrainian regime been willing to negotiate before it started. They refused it over and over again, and now the consequences are there for the Ukrainian people to pick up the pieces, because when it finally comes to an end, you know and I know the United States will just walk away.
Eoin Ó Murchú, former political editor at Raidió na Gaeltachta, writer with Tuairisc.ie. Let's leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, William, we're just off our interview with Owen. I take it that you were a little bit frustrated with that interview.
Just a little bit, yeah. Owen, obviously, is a long-time radio journalist on Raidió na Gaeltachta. He knows how to speak very tenaciously, but I really think he might add listening skills to his repertoire. I think there was an awful lot of points missed there, and that was pretty frustrating. And I really want to avoid thinking that he was shouting down points because he didn't want to have to answer those questions. But I'll let the listeners make a decision on that.
Okay. On the issue of civilian targets being hit, Owen was, I suppose, trying to throw doubt on what the, I suppose, common understanding of the issue is in Ireland. Were any of his points valid?
I think there was one point that probably is valid, which is that it's relatively easy to produce some footage of soldiers, troops entering an area and being welcomed and given hugs and cups of tea or whatever. That's relatively easy to stage. And that is true on both sides. That does kind of make the point that Owen was saying that, I'll get to in a moment, but Owen was saying that Russian troops were being welcomed. It equally undermines that. But the fact is that there is mass reporting from Ukraine by a huge number of different reputable sources. And they have the effect of all cross-confirming the huge number of attacks that there have been on civilian infrastructure, on residential areas. You can see videos of bombed out apartment blocks. That's very, very clear. And in fact, Russian politicians themselves and the Russian pro-Kremlin media have been explicitly saying that they are deliberately targeting and taking out the civilian power infrastructure. that's a war crime. There's no question about that. Under the Geneva Conventions, that is a war crime. And Eoin was throwing in this line that the UN had said that there had been 10,000 people killed and that there had been shelling incidents, or whatever number he quoted. That's a very, very questionable use of UN statistics. So the UN keeps a record of ceasefire violations. So since 2014, there was effectively a line of control where the Russians had taken over part of the Luhansk Oblast and the Donetsk Oblast. The fighting had stopped, but there was a sort of a shaky ceasefire. And what the UN is counting is any violation of that ceasefire from whatever source. And to say that the Ukrainian army is responsible for all of the violations is just crazy. You know, that they're in the territory of Ukraine. They're fully within their legal rights to expel the Russian forces from anywhere in that area. And this figure of 10,000 people killed, that is available only from Russian-controlled sources. There's been no verification of that. And that does not have that cross-verification where you have multiple different media organizations reporting the same thing. You get that from one source only, and that's from the Kremlin.
Okay, so Eoin mentioned that Russia has three demands: a neutral Ukraine, and an end to attacks on Russian-speaking ethnic Russians in Donbass and the south, and a stop to the glorification of Nazis like Stepan Bandera. Are these deliverable?
It's not even clear what they mean. So, first of all, there's a confusion between the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, which is almost certainly a majority of the population, and ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine and are Ukrainian citizens. Confusing those two is basically like saying that in Ireland, everyone who speaks English is a unionist and everyone who speaks Irish is a nationalist. It just doesn't work like that. The best estimate that I've seen is about 13% of the Ukrainian population are ethnic Russians. And it's difficult to say because a lot of people are bilingual. But if you were to say, like, what's your first language? Russian is certainly bigger than Ukrainian. That's notable, for example, that Zelensky does not speak Ukrainian, or certainly doesn't speak it terribly well, partly because he grew up in a Russian-speaking area in Ukraine, partly obviously also because he spent part of his childhood actually in Russia. So you have to be clear on what that is, but there's just no evidence outside Kremlin sources that there was any significant level of attacks or discrimination on Russian speakers or ethnic Russians, either of those two groups, in Ukraine. And the great bulk of Russian speakings are on the Ukrainian side, that's to say not in Russian-controlled territory, and are fighting in the Ukrainian army and doing various other things to support the Ukrainian war effort. So that just doesn't seem to make sense. And Ukraine being neutral, I think this is one of the supposed demands of Putin as well. That's not very well defined, but it seems to be, by how Russia defines it, is that Ukraine is left essentially naked and defenseless and gets no assistance from anywhere else should Russia decide to start up a war again against them after some putative ceasefire that might come. So I think those demands are designed to be undeliverable. And there's also this character who is definitely a very problematic character, who's a Ukrainian nationalist who was allied to the Nazis during World War II, and he is on, stamps and the statues and so forth of him in Ukraine. That is true. But if we look at our own country, and you were to look at Pádraig Pearse or Daniel O'Connell and try to bring them in to the current polity of 21st century Ireland, they would be utterly unacceptable, the sort of views that they held. I don't want to go into detail on that, but trying to transpose somebody, a national myth or a national hero into today's politics just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're a little bit different, but I understand.
Sure, yeah, they're different.
About the national myth. You did mention someone who you thought might be very similar to Stepan Bandera. You mentioned his character, Eoin Ó Murchú, who Owen didn't want to talk much about. Who is he and how significant is he historically?
He is in no way like Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera was a fighter. Eoin Ó Murchú was, I guess you could call him a fighter. He was a general, so not somebody who got his hands dirty. In the White Russian, that's to say the Tsarist army, which fought against the Russian Revolution, so there was the Reds and the Whites. The Reds were the communists who obviously eventually won. That wasn't very healthy for people like Eoin Ó Murchú, who was from the Tsarist elite, which is why he was in that position. So he then took refuge after the Russian Revolution, and that was obviously after World War I. He was a virulent fascist. He was a very strong supporter of the Nazis coming to power in Germany, although he did fall out with the Nazis later and he went to live in Switzerland. And he was a writer. I mean, he's called sometimes a philosopher. I think that's putting it a bit grandly. But his whole belief system was of a Russian empire which was controlled by a single strong man. He was completely opposed to democracy, and he was incredibly chauvinistically prejudiced against Ukrainians in particular. And it is notable that when Putin says Ukraine doesn't exist, or it's not a real country, and he says things that basically mean that there's no such thing as Ukrainians, they're just misguided Russians. This is exactly the line that Eoin Ó Murchú takes. And actually in his writing, Eoin Ó Murchú uses quotation marks around Ukrainians whenever he uses the word. In other words, he's signaling that he just doesn't believe it exists. And this guy, because he was obviously an anti-communist, he was, like all his books were banned in Soviet times, so he wasn't very well known in the Soviet Union. He wasn't relevant outside Russia. So he's not terribly, not a great author of any note, but he has been hugely influential on Putin's elite since Putin essentially took over, or since the fall of communism, probably. And a measure of how well they regard him. First of all, as I tried to show, I think, in the interview with, and in fact, I'm going to play the clips now, as I tried to show in the interview with Owen, Putin references him very, very frequently in his speeches, often at very key points. And for the sake of clarity, this is just the ending of the speech. This is the final, penultimate point of the speech that Putin gave to a huge audience of notables to mark the annexation of these 4 Ukrainian provinces.
Хочу завершить свое выступление словами настоящего патриота Ивана Александровича Ильина. Если я считаю моей родиной Россию.
So there he's talking about the patriot Eoin Ó Murchú, and he's putting him, he mentions him in very, very many speeches, but he puts him in even the most prominent place in the speech. And I play that in Russian just because I wanted people to hear that he is saying that. And I anticipated Owen not wanting to hear that, but I'll play that with the live translation here.
I would like to conclude my address with the words of the true patriot, Eoin Ó Murchú. If I consider Russia my motherland, it means that I love in Russian way, that I create and think in Russian.
So that's him ending his speech there and saying how influential Eoin is on him. And to give you an idea just how Putin regards Eoin obviously died in Switzerland in the 1950s. Putin organized for Eoin's remains to be exhumed and returned to Russia and placed in a specially built mausoleum. And when Putin saw the plans for the mausoleum, he decided that it was insufficiently grand, and he personally, allegedly his own money, I suspect, well, I won't comment on Putin's money too much, but he personally funded a far grander mausoleum to be built to hold the remains of Eoin Ó Murchú. So there's just no question that he is huge in Putin's worldview. And he was writing up to the end of his life in the 1950s, mid-1950s, and everything he wrote was essentially supporting fascism, particularly supporting Nazism, because he spent that portion of his life in Germany. And the accusation that you can find some reason to say that the current government of Ukraine is influenced by Nazis to a greater degree than that is really nonsense.
Okay. I want to go back to the question of the kind of Russians in Ukraine, the Russian-speaking people, and the Russian minority. He said that. So Eoin said that the majority of people in the Ukrainian provinces voted with great relief and for rejoining with Russia. To what extent is that valid?
Well, to a degree, you can say we don't know because we weren't there. And like, as I said earlier, it's fairly easy to manufacture a video clip of, villagers smiling and welcoming whatever troops arriving. And there have been plenty of clips of that happening with Ukrainian troops arriving. They could be all genuine, but somebody like Eoin could say, well, they could be manufactured. Equally, that could be manufactured on the Russian side, and I suspect that may be the case. But the reason I suspect that may be the case is because of things that are harder to fake. So the first thing that is harder to fake is what happened historically. So in 1991, there was the referendum which Ukraine decided to leave the Soviet Union. This was after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that had massive support in Ukraine, 92% across the whole country, including in the Kherson province, the one that was partially retaken by Ukraine recently. 90% of people voted to leave the Soviet Union and become an independent country. That has never, in the 30-odd years since that has happened, that's never been questioned as a valid and democratic election, that there wasn't any particular democratic problems with that. To put that against the vote, and I'm using air quotes here, the vote under Putin while Kherson was under occupation, that supposedly had some miraculous number of people voting to agree to join Russia. First of all, we have film clips of that happening from both from Russian sources and from things like surveillance cameras. People literally voting at the point of a gun. They literally have somebody in uniform pointing a gun at them while they're voting. That is not what I would count as a free and fair exercise of democracy. But also what we saw in February and in March, when Kherson was first occupied by Russian troops, there were a large amount of clips posted which are easy to geolocate because they have prominent buildings in the center of the city of Kherson in them, and had large demonstrations of people, of civilians protesting against the occupation, of people standing in front of tanks, of people gathering and waving Ukrainian flags and being sometimes actually seeming to succeed to persuade Russian troops to go away out of their village or whatever, sometimes being shot, having, shots fired over their head, sometimes actually being shot at. So that's just not credible, that where you have relatively large demonstrations under a very oppressive occupation, that's a clear indication that those people are very unlikely months later to vote almost unanimously to support that annexation. So I have to say, I think that's nonsense. And you then have to say, okay, if that's not credible, then anything else that tends to support this, which is not credible, is probably also questionable. And Eoin mentioned the American journalist. I will say he's not trained as a journalist. He's a former United States Marine, a guy called Patrick Lancaster. He is embedded with the Russian army. That's to say, he's essentially a member of the Russian army with reporting duties at this stage. He has never worked journalistically for any outlet other than Kremlin-funded ones. So every single journalistic job he has had has been with Kremlin-funded outlets. And there have been numerous accusations that his reporting has been just entirely false. But one in particular was analysed by Bellingcat. They're a British website, highly analytical. So they use they use social media to gather photographs, and they publish photo analysis and so forth. And with one particular report from him, supposedly of a bomb attack, it's clear from their report that that report was entirely fabricated from start to finish.
All right. So we've briefly talked about Russian popular support within Ukraine. We've talked about the issue of Stepan Bandera. The other thing was Russia's goals in Ukraine. And you've mentioned this article on the Russian government news, which you suggested says what they really think. Can you expand a bit more on that and tell us what it tells you?
Yeah, sure. I think sometimes Eoin might be a little bit guilty of it. Some people are more guilty of trying to be Vladimir Putin's, long distance therapist or something, whereby he says one thing, but they decide that he thinks something else and they kind of know what he really thinks. I think if you want to know what Putin really thinks and what the elite around him really think, you just have to listen to what they're saying. And first of all, the website RIA Novosti is the Russian government news service. So that's different to, for example, a private TV station that has been bought out by a friend of Putin's who very strictly enforces the government line. It's different to maybe like an RTE style state TV station, which would also be very much under Kremlin control. This is actually run by the Kremlin. So it's one step closer again. I think Eoin almost tried to characterize it as some sort of Wikipedia whereby anybody could go in and write an article. That's just not true. And in particular, that news agency, RIA Novosti, in its current incarnation, was created by a decree issued by Vladimir Putin. He literally created it himself. And the article that I'm referring to is written by a guy called Timofey Sergeytsev. He is a writer and he's a political operator. He is very close to Putin's circle. And he essentially writes this article, which in translation is called "What Should We Do About Ukraine?" And it's really clear what they're saying. They explicitly say they want to wipe out the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian civil society. And I just want to play this clip because I think it's relevant.
Today will be remembered. Today is history and you are part of it. 600 years ago, Casimir the Great, so-called, told the Jews they could come to Krakow. They came. They trundled their belongings into the city. They settled. They took hold. They prospered. They came here with nothing. Nothing. And they flourished. For 6 centuries, there has been a Jewish Krakow. Think about that. By this evening, those 6 centuries are a rumor. They never happened. Today is history.
And that is the words of Amon Goeth, as interpreted by Ranulph Fiennes in the film Schindler's List, obviously the standout film about the Holocaust. And I played that because of the similarity, and just to remind people that obviously the Holocaust was about murdering millions of people, murdering millions of Jews, but it was a very important part of the Nazi ideology to wipe out Jewish culture, to wipe out the contribution they'd made to literature, to the arts, to the sciences. And the comparison is absolutely striking if you read this article by Timofey Sergeytsev. He is absolutely explicit that he wants to wipe out, and the word he uses translates as liquidate. It's likvidatsiya. It's literally the word liquidate in Russian. To liquidate the entire intelligentsia in Ukraine. And we saw, for example, when Bucha was recaptured by Ukrainians, the people like the mayor and all, the kind of leading people in society were the people who were targeted for being murdered. The article by Sergeytsev says explicitly they want to wipe out the Ukrainian language. It says explicitly that everyone who has any connection with the Ukrainian army must be liquidated. And I mentioned that to Eoin, and he said, oh yeah, well, that's defeating the Ukrainian army. No, it's not. And that's absolutely not what the article says. It says that anyone who has ever had a connection with the army must be liquidated. And it goes through essentially a shopping list of how they will destroy the cultural, the linguistic, the historical existence of Ukraine. And it ends up by saying that then the rest of the population, basically the people who they don't kill, should be subjected to forced re-education for 25 years as a punishment for supposedly supporting a Nazi government. And that is what is written on Russian government website, very prominent writer, very prominent website. That's what they're saying they want to do. And, a little bit like the abusive partner who says they're going to do whatever violence to their partner. When they say they're going to do this, believe them. And again, just to answer Eoin saying, kind of trying to dismiss the level of connection between that particular article and the Russian government. It's worth noting that in the days after it was published, the contents of the article were repeated by various Putin loyalists, including former President and former Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. And there has been no rowing back. Nobody, neither Putin or anyone close to him or any of, sources close to him made any effort to distance themselves from that intention. And I think it's just really ridiculous. And other people, including, for example, certain MEPs in Ireland, have put themselves forward as people who understand the mind of Vladimir Putin and understand what we have to offer to him in order to persuade him to end this invasion. I'd really like to know where those people are getting their information from.
Okay, well, following up on that then, and it's going to sound kind of strange, a little bit naive then, but Eoin Ó Murchú was pushing the idea of negotiations, and we've had other guests on the podcast before who have discussed the idea of negotiations. I know there are people in the European Parliament who have been saying something similar.
Yes, we're talking about Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. We shouldn't really beat around that bush.
Yeah. So, a lot of people might say something similar. It might sound reasonable. So how does this end? How would we? Would you agree that that's how things should go?
Well, in the last couple of days, it is notable that Putin has said that a prerequisite for him entering into any negotiations would be for Crimea and the 4 more recently seized provinces, the annexation of them into Russia proper, to be recognized by Ukraine and by the West. So in other words, before the negotiations happen, they have to sign those away. Saying, we want negotiations is something that sounds reasonable and something that's designed to sound reasonable. But a negotiation is two-sided. Each party gives something and is offered something if it is to be successful. And the question is, what does Ukraine have to offer? And what does Russia have to offer? Eoin has made his 3 things. He somehow, through the ether, is able to define that what Putin wants. There's no falsifiability there. There's nobody could ever say this. This is something been done apart from neutrality of Ukraine. So Ukraine would effectively not be allowed to accept any assistance to defend itself. Other than that, it appears that Ukraine would have to accept giving away large swathes of its territory. But what would Russia offer in return? And I don't see that they have anything to offer other than stopping the war. And I think it's worth listening to what the Russian ambassador to the US said on the 20th of February. This is the 20th of February, 4 days before the invasion.
I'll get right to it. President Biden says that President Putin has decided to invade Ukraine. Is he correct?
There is no innovation and there is no such plans. It was fixed in Russian documents that we conveyed to our American friends in State Department. Russia has publicly declared its readiness to continue the diplomatic efforts to resolve all outstanding issues. Russian troops are on a sovereign Russian territory. We don't threaten anyone.
That was literally 4 days before they launched, a massive invasion of Ukraine. You can't prepare a massive invasion of that size in 4 days. You can't even prepare it in 4 weeks. It takes closer to 4 months. So, that was an outright lie. And there is very little indication that anything they would say could be trusted. So promising not to invade again seems like a very, very weak thing to offer. And if, for example, even if there was some negotiation and Ukraine only gave away 2 of its provinces instead of 5, for example, what's to stop Russia from pausing for a year, restocking, resupplying, trying to perhaps train some of those mobilized soldiers, trying to get its arms industry back together again and produce more weapons. And when they're good and ready to invade Ukraine again, Ukraine at this point promising not to accept any military assistance from any outside country, and obviously is a fraction of the size of Russia, that's clearly nonsense. I think there are just so many questions there that we have raised that it's really difficult for me to understand how anyone with a tiny amount of intelligence and integrity could say that that's a reasonable position. Now, I know that we have, for example, and these are, I think they are careful to put daylight between themselves and Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, but PPP, People Before Profit, will say things like Yemen is under attack, people in Palestine are under attack as well, and they are entitled to defence. And it sounds a bit like whataboutery, but it's a reasonable thing to say. It's reasonable to say that the Ukrainians are not the only people being attacked. And it is reasonable to say that there is hypocrisy in the West in supporting Ukraine and not supporting people in Syria, Yemen, Palestine, and so forth. That's a reasonable thing to say. It is perhaps a more easier message to give out. But I think in fairness to People Before Profit, they have been pretty clear in their condemnation of Putin and of Russia, and they are not politically aligned to them. And they were not. They are a different faction of far left. I'm not going to go into that theology essentially now, but Owen said that he hadn't been a member of the Workers' Party, but he was a member of the wider official Republican movement, which I think is a euphemism for saying that he was in some way associated with the official IRA, who were very much closely linked to the Soviet Union. And it seems like maybe Putin, astonishingly, has inherited the loyalty of some people on the far left to the Soviet Union. Other than that, I just can't explain it.
You're not saying that Eoin Ó Murchú was in the official IRA?
Eoin Ó Murchú can clarify that for himself.
Okay. Right. I think we'll leave it there.
Talk to you again, Kevin.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Eoin Ó Murchú at E. Ó Murchú, if you dare, and get in touch with us if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Thanks again to Sean and all the other patrons on Patreon. As I said, it pays for things like web hosting. We basically do the podcast for free. But if you could do the same as the current donors and chip in the price of a selection box or even the price of a curly whirly once a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All of that information is at www.here'show.ie.